Hello, everyone, and welcome to another small framed presentation for week 8. All right, so your readings for this week they continue to develop the legacies of the First World War, and in these slides, I really want to focus on the interwar period, with quite a focus on Europe, and basically develop a framework for understanding the post-war liberal consensus that would emerge by 1945, and basically the development of the world structures that we still have to this day. And let me get my face out of the way. So I think it's appropriate that we start with this painting of Guernica. That was Pablo Picasso's way of trying to understand the obliteration of a small Basque village in the north of Spain during the Spanish Revolution that represented, not just the horrors of war as was seen in World War I, but the horrors of war being brought home to European civilian populations. Okay, so let's get my face out of the way. All right, I showed you this map last week, and it's this was basically the map intended to bring peace to Europe, which had roughly, it seems, the opposite effect. So irredentism and revanchism are two words that I briefly talked about in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, and what so this slide nicely illustrates the main problem with the nationalistic assumption that one's country's borders needed to be enlarged. So this map shows some Central European borders in the 1930s versus what nationalists often claimed the borders should have been. So as you can see, many areas of Europe were claimed by more than one state. So one of the reasons for Hitler's popularity in Eastern Europe was his promise to help redraw national boundaries to better reflect ethnic lines. So millions of Romanians and Hungarians, for example, fought for Hitler against the Soviets because he promised to support both of their claims to the Transylvania region. Uh, so just take a look at this. Like, this little pink here is what Hungary was, but this is what Hungarians claimed. The problem was that in order to meet their claim, they would have to do something about Romanians, uh, you know, Bulgarians, Croatians, uh, in areas that they wanted for themselves. So, extreme nationalism in the aftermath of World War I was by no means an exclusive German problem. This, one problem with German minorities, at least for nationalists, was that they were scattered across Eastern Europe. So, one of the things Hitler promised was to unite them into, a larger Germany. Um, so, German minorities, of course, they received poor treatment across Eastern Europe, and this was discursive gold for Nazi propagandists like Joseph Goebbels. So virtually every radio broadcast of his during the 1930s included something about how terrible the Jews were and how terribly Germans were being treated everywhere that wasn't inside of Germany. So, okay, there's a Holocaust historian, Saul Friedlander, who used the idea of a crisis of liberalism to describe the frenetic, messianic anti-Semitism, also a term of his, that motivated so many far-right thinkers in Europe in the run-up to the Holocaust. Friedlander was one of the first historians to emphasize the European-wide nature of Holocaust perpetrators, that it wasn't just the Germans, or other Germans forcing some Germans to, as the guilty often pretended in 1945, but that across Europe, the Holocaust was possible because of active, willing, voluntary participation. In the minds of the far right, Jewish people were somehow behind everything that was wrong with the world. So by the 1930s, there was a crisis of liberalism where many in the world felt that either the extremes of communism or the extremes of nationalistic fascism were preferable to what they considered to be broken democracy. Broken democracy was responsible in their minds for the breakdowns leading up to World War I. And in the simplistic worldview of fascists and the far right, the other two systems, communism and capitalist democracy, were controlled by Jewish people. So to simple-minded bigots, the logic worked, and the Shoah would be the result. I include this little propaganda poster right here because it shows a few things. You can't see it very well on this slide, but this is supposed to be a stereotypical caricature of a Jewish person. This guy has dollar signs in his glasses. And you see the world with spider webs controlling the symbols of Freemasonry, of dollars, of communism. And what it says is his tools are democracy, masonry, communism, and capitalism. So just this notion that everything that seems wrong with the world isn't the result of complicated problems that need intelligent analysts to figure out. It's the problem of something simple-minded, and you can blame someone for their problem, for your problems. You don't need to take responsibility for your problems. You can blame someone. It's the idea of scapegoating. So I've uh, I've got a lot of detail on this next slide. But in 1917, the Bolshevik wing of the Russian Communist Party won significant support in the ongoing Russian conflict with their promise of bread, land, and peace. So when they seized control of St. Petersburg, or what was called Petrograd at the time, later renamed Leningrad, they pulled Russia out of the Great War, but quite quickly found themselves in the middle of an even more violent war with fellow Russians, and eventually troops from several European countries and the United States as they tried to take over the Russian Empire. By 1922, this Bolshevik wing of the Communist Party would victoriously declare the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. But just to give you a little bit of background of what's happening here. So in February, there was a revolution to overthrow the Tsar. And between February and October of 1917, they had a somewhat functional Russian parliament, the same Duma that had been established in the revolution of 1905. So this provisional government with Alexander Kerensky at the head, they continued the war. And everybody hated the war. Russians were dying by the millions. And so the Bolsheviks promised to get out of the war. The Bolsheviks were supported by the Germans secretly. Lenin was supported by the Germans because they knew he would get one of their big enemies out of the war. And so as soon as he claimed control over the Russian Empire, many white forces and green forces, led by people like Denikhin, Wrangel, Kolchak, Makhno, they fought this bloody civil war where 6 million Russians died before finally establishing the USSR. And this right here is a still from a propaganda movie on the seizing of the Winter Palace in Leningrad, and it was produced like 2 years after the actual conflict itself. So even before the revolution in Russia was over, though, the Communist International, basically the global club of communists, called the Comintern, within Russia, tried to foment revolutions around the world. You have to remember what a horrific year 1919 was. In 1919, there were conflicts all over Europe as people tried to redraw the boundaries of the Paris Peace Accords. Nobody was social distancing as they should have been, which meant that perhaps 50 million people died from the Spanish flu of that year. And, it was just an all around bad year when many communist thinkers inside of Russia thought maybe this is the Great Revolution, now that a capitalist war is over that's supposed to lead the world into communism. Lenin and Trotsky in particular believed that after 1918, a revolution was going to happen. So in Hungary and Berlin, communists briefly took control. And communist parties were then outlawed throughout the world. In many other countries, like the United States, it caused red scares as conservative forces became, in many cases, justifiably hysterical about communist parties trying through undemocratic means to cause revolution. In many cases, these red scares caused much more conservative powers to take over, such as Miklos Horthy's far-right government in Hungary. So, the Spartakian revolt in Berlin eventually led to the Weimar Republic, which, was a functional democracy in 1919, or maybe I should call it dysfunctional. And then within Russia, there was, of course, a split within those who wanted immediately revolution all over the world and those who didn't. So I want to get to that here. Uh, okay, so once the Soviet Union was established, several prominent ideologues arose arguing over how best to administer the new revolution. So people like Leon Trotsky in the middle, he wanted to jumpstart the revolution globally immediately. He became pretty unpopular after Lenin died. Down on the bottom, you've got Bukharin, who he was kind of the gradualist. He fell out of favor too. Stalin believed that socialism could be achieved by skipping over the stage of capitalism. You remember when we read Marx a few weeks ago, there was this idea that every state needs progress, every society needs to progress through the stages of feudalism, then capitalism, then socialism, then eventually at some distant future point, communism. Well, everybody agreed that Russia was still a feudal country, and Stalin said maybe we can jump from feudalism straight to socialism. Bukharin was like, no, 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 we need to develop a functional capitalist country first. So Stalin was immensely popular among ordinary Russians. He invested in large infrastructural projects. He tried to give people jobs. He spoke in sort of an earthy manner. He wasn't against, occasionally swearing, and he did a wonderful job. Not wonderful, a horrific job convincing ordinary Russians, the man on the street, that the real enemy was, the officials of the government. He to use more modern terms, he described bureaucrats as if they were the deep state, the swamp, working against him. And so much of Stalinism involved persecuting government officials who didn't agree with him. And often this resulted in their deaths as well. So here's a picture of just how big the Soviet Union was. This is an enormously influential country. So Stalinism then, for so many at the time, was represented by things like this. Stalin didn't like to just build things. He always wanted things to be the biggest in the world, the best in the world. So here's the Magnitogorsk Steel Works, which was built under Stalinism in the 1930s, and it was the biggest steel mill in the world. Not that they needed the biggest steel mill in the world in the middle of the Ural Mountains, but it was important for Stalin to be able to say that. So to fund this industrialization, so many countries, when they develop, they go into debt. Stalin didn't really have credit. It's not like the big bankers of the day trusted the Soviet Union to pay back loans. So, in order to get the money he needed, he decided to force farmers to become more efficient. So the scissors crisis, as it was called at the time, was his effort to artificially lower agricultural prices and then increase the price people paid for food, like the spreading of scissors. So, one thing goes down, one thing goes up, and then the surplus money was used to invest in factories, in dams, and canals. So, to compensate for this, he decided to force farmers into collective farms where things would be done more efficiently, ideally, so that low prices for farm products could still work. Uh, the result was a massive famine that hit agricultural Ukraine the hardest. In this artificial famine called the Holodomor, which means death by hunger, uh, roughly 1 million people, 1 million Ukrainians and Russians in the Don region died. Some estimate that as many as 12 million people died, but the best scholarly estimates are still devastatingly high, about 1 million people. So the longer Stalin was in power as well, the more paranoid he became. His great purges of 1937 and 1938 killed approximately 350,000 officials and destroyed the officer corps of the military. His gulag system, or forced labor camps in Siberia, imprisoned millions of suspected ethnic minorities, common criminals, and people suspected of being political opponents, usually named after ideologues from previous decades like Trotskyites, Bukharinites, etc. So the full scale of his crimes against humanity weren't publicly acknowledged until his successor, Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956, or even later once Stalin-era archives were opened in the 1980s. But before all this oppression became common knowledge, In much of the Middle East, in the colonial world, Stalinism was seen as an effective way to build power. Trying to jumpstart economic development with the building of large dams or mills became commonplace in the Third World, as depicted in this image of Magnitogorsk. So, and again, another thing I should probably say as an aside, there, for decades there has been this assumption that Stalin killed more people than Hitler. And one of the really nasty reasons to argue this is, on the one hand, to be anti-communist, which is fine, but on the other, it's to sort of excuse Hitler. And so, I want to be pretty clear and blunt and to the point. Stalin did not kill more people than Hitler. I've seen estimates as high as 60 million, which are just utter and total nonsense. The total of people killed, you know, deliberately murdered under Stalin, by the end of his power in 1953 when he died, was roughly 750,000. And then if you count, those who died in the artificial famine in Ukraine and Russia, then that adds another, roughly another million people. So that is not to justify Stalin. That is not to somehow argue that all of it is okay or anything like that. But it is to be clear and factual. Hitler, murder was central to his ideology of racial superiority, whereas for Stalin, murder was something he did to maintain his power. Okay, and murder is wrong. No, nobody should do it. Find a different hobby. All right, so shortly after the First World War, the first place where active fascism emerged was in Italy. Italians found that their economy was in shambles, and conservatives in the country felt deeply offended that they had won so little territory from the Paris Peace Conference. So in 1922, Benito Mussolini, who had become leader of a far-right group calling themselves fascists after the Roman symbol of unity, you break one arrow easily, but you can't break many that are bundled together into a fascia. It's not an uncommon motif. You see it on our American eagle holding a fasces of arrows on your dollar bills. But he led his famous Black Shirt March on Rome. And it was essentially a media spectacle and a coup where he demanded the reins of power, and he got them. So over the next few years, the Italian economy did recover. The trains began to run on time, as was promised, and Italians gambled away human rights for economic and political security. Italian fascism set a model for other fascist governments by finding middle ground, so they thought, between pure socialism and pure capitalism. The Italian economy was organized under syndicates, which coordinated the work of still private enterprises to reduce speculation and maximize the public good, and Italian armaments, not unlike what Americans tried under the National Recovery Act with Roosevelt, or it's not unlike what Americans did do during the First World War. So by the 1930s, the Italians seized on the irredentism again, this notion that your land isn't what it should be, of the First World War, and they reasserted control over Libya. Then they attacked independent Abyssinia, Ethiopia, which had fought them off in the 1880s, this time using poison gas, illegal by international law, dropped by airplane, among other tools of war considered illegal by the Hague Conventions. They also conquered Albania and dreamed of a European war that would give them control over more of Yugoslavia and even Greece. The militant far-right nationalism of Italy seemed an inspiration to many in the world. It seemed like the Italians had figured out how to avoid the uncertainty of post-war depression and the reverberations of things like the American stock market crash of 1929. So by the mid 1930s, much of the world had become polarized between the far right and the far left. One government that had been largely nationalistic for the 20th century was overthrown in favor of a free republic, that was Spain. The Spanish Republic was supported by a coalition of left-leaning parties that pioneered the use of a popular front, Basically, anyone who could support Spanish democracy was welcomed into the fold. They were opposed by the National Front, right leaning parties. So in 1936, a guy named Francisco Franco, a general fighting in Morocco, returned to Spain to overthrow this leftist government by force, following the lead of Mussolini, Horthy, and Hitler, to name a few. Republicans didn't go without a fight, and the Spanish Civil War became a focal point of right wing versus left wing conflict around the world. The Soviets and numerous left leaning organizations sent volunteers. Thousands came to fight for the Republican side from the United States. Germans and Italians, too, sent troops to fight for the other side, the nationalists. The German Luftwaffe destroyed a Basque town, the German Air Force, Luftwaffe, in the early morning of April 26, 1937. That's the painting I had on my very first slide, killing hundreds who were memorialized by Pablo Picasso's anti-war painting named after the town, Guernica. Franco's forces won the Civil War, but the battles of this war were a proving ground for those who would soon lead resistance movements to Nazi fascism across Europe. It can easily be seen as a prelude to World War II. So one British innovation that was seized on by the United States was the deficit spending policies advocated by the British economist John Maynard Keynes in this period. So by the 1930s, the idea that there's a business cycle, that economies go up, economies go down, was quite well understood. A British economist, John Maynard Keynes, who became popular in the 1930s, argued that periods of economic downturn could be alleviated through government spending. Now remember, so much of what's driving people into the right and the left across the world in this period is that they're dealing with depressions. So he even argued that deficit spending made sense under such conditions, as it could flatten the business cycle and allow for more prosperities to pay back those taxes. This is something many of you are dealing with right now. If you get a stimulus check, that is the purpose of it. So these ideas were cautiously flirted with by Hoover's administration in public works projects, and wholeheartedly embraced by Roosevelt. They remain controversial today. Uh, but a Keynesian idea is those stimulus checks I mentioned. The idea was that greasing the economy with extra cash would get people spending and prevent the kind of downturn that would make businesses have to permanently close. Um, all right, so as this global crisis of liberalism was ongoing, the economy of the United States, though in shambles after the stock market crash of 1929, attempted to find a way to avoid the extremes that had engulfed so much of the world, essentially to show that democracy could still work. Many of Roosevelt's economic and social policies outlined in this slide were meant to couch capitalism enough to smooth out its rough edges while still protecting its core essence. Roosevelt's policies were controversial in the U.S., especially among Republicans, but they helped inspire the ideals of activist welfare states that would dominate northwestern Europe once the Second World War came to an end, and much of the developing world as well. Ultimately, the U.S., through its overwhelming economic power, was able to build a basis for lasting global economic and political institutions at the end of World War II. Roosevelt's goal was to preserve American capitalism and democracy in the face of unprecedented global challenges to both. So, looking at the structures of his National Recovery Act, as well as the other major initiatives he unveiled in his first 100 days, is quite instructive. You should remember that at the same time he was in his first 100 days in office, someone else was starting their chancellorship as well, Adolf Hitler, and the world was watching both of them very closely. One key element of the New Deal was the National Recovery Act, which, just like Mussolini's syndicalism or the policies of Hoover during World War I, was meant to coordinate the production of American industry. It wasn't as extreme as a Soviet command economy. Private owners still managed their own businesses, but it was incredibly restrictive for peacetime as well. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the NRA was unconstitutional, not to be confused with the National Rifle Association. So one theme that ran through the New Deals, both before and after the Supreme Court overruled the NRA, was a hope that government aid wouldn't create welfare dependency. So groups like the Works Project Administration funded cultural work, like the painting in the Delhi post office. Um, The Civilian Conservation Corps was an organization that provided food, shelter, and a small wage to teenage boys and young men in exchange for manual labor all over the country, especially in national parks. Uh, Here's a picture of a Civilian Conservation Corps group near Davenport. If any of you have ever hiked the Glen Trail at Watkins Glen State Park, those amazing staircases were carved and built by the CCC. So, as the Depression continued, regulations for banks and ever more federal spending occurred. Many like to argue that the massive spending for World War II ultimately pulled the U.S. out of the Depression. So, a manifestation of far right fascist sentiment gaining political power was in Germany. You had all the right ingredients there: resentment that the Versailles Treaty seemed to be overly punitive, a failing economy, and opportunistic politicians willing to churn up resentment against people who had nothing to do with German problems but seemed easy targets. So, over the course of the 1930s, the Nazi government first got rid of the democratic institutions. So, Hitler was democratically elected, he was appointed chancellor. Um, and then he, started playing games. In February, he burned down the Reichstag building, or set a fire in it, blamed the communists, which allowed him to become a dictator through the Enabling Act in March of 1933. Then in 1935, he passed a series of laws that defined Jewish people as subjects rather than citizens. Um, so in over the course of the 1930s, the Nazi government, the first thing they did was get rid of democratic institutions. Then they rebuilt German social security and health insurance programs, as well as embarking on a massive infrastructural and military building scheme. Nazis were wildly popular by the end of the 1930s, by which time they had joined with Austria, forcibly retaken the Saar and Ruhr regions, as well as the independent country of Czechoslovakia. They had also legally removed Jewish people from public life, stripping them of rights to engage in virtually any dealings with other Germans. Um, and I shouldn't say other Germans either, as Jewish people were stripped of their citizenship in 1935. So by the time the Nazis invaded Poland with a secret agreement to divide it with the Soviets, Hitler fully expected that Western governments wouldn't care. For the British and French, however, this was one country too much, so they declared war, and a few months later, really began fighting that war. Okay, I've got a few bonus questions for you to try your hand at, and you know, again, I wish you a good week, good luck, and we'll talk about World War II next week.